Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Cecilia, Director of the NCBFAA Educational Institute, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's presentation. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that all attendees are in listen-only mode. However, you can type questions into the question box on the webinar toolbar at any time, which we will address at the end, time permitting. Additionally, we will be running some poll questions throughout the presentation, which we would like you to take a moment to answer once they are launched. I'm excited to welcome a panel of experts as our speakers today. Sandy Cody from A.N. Deringer is the NCBFAA's EPA RAC Subcommittee Chair and Vice President of the LA Brokers and Forwarders Association, and she will be our lead presenter today. She is joined by Roy Chade and Mario Jorquera from EPA, who will introduce themselves now.
Hi, this is Mario Jorquera. I'm an engineer in the Vehicle and Engine Enforcement Branch at EPA's Air Enforcement Division. And I am the principal person that is reviewing the filings for vehicles and engines at EPA. And I have been working at EPA for about 25 years, about 15 of them in vehicle and engine matters.
And I'm Roy Chade. I'm the ACE technical lead, and I've been working, I guess, with ACE since about 2007. And I'm usually the front line of guys that you need to contact if you have questions. So with that, why don't we ask the polling questions, Cece? So as you can see, we're trying to find out a little bit about who you are first. So if you could please answer, who's joining us today? That's great. Okay. And we had there we go. Second question is, what's your experience with vehicle and engine declarations? All right, so this is good. So we have 23% that are completely new to this and 15% where they've never filed one in ACE but are familiar with it. So that's about 38% this is kind of new. And then the rest have either done some filing or do it regularly. So that's great. Okay, I think with that we can move on to our next slide and have Sandy kick it off here.
All right. So we're going to start off with Mario providing an overview of what and why EPA regulates vehicles and engines. Mario?
Okay. Basically what happens is that the Clean Air Act said that EPA had to develop standards for vehicles and engines so that they met, to show that they met the air quality requirements. And so when vehicles and engines are imported, we check to see that the vehicles and engines are either meeting the standards or have some kind of exception or exclusion. The types of things we look at are light-duty motor vehicles. That's the things you see on the highway, like pickup trucks and cars and minivans and stuff like that. Motorcycles, highway motorcycles, and off-highway motorcycles, heavy-duty on-highway engines, the kind of thing that you would see inside a semi-truck, for example. But we also regulate non-road engines, things that are in the construction equipment, for example, or even small things like weed whackers that are gasoline-powered. We regulate marine engines. That goes all the way from a small outboard for trolling all the way to the huge marine vessels. And also recreational vehicles, things like dirt bikes, ATVs, and snowmobiles, and utility vehicles like ATVs and UTVs. And these standards apply for new and used vehicles and engines. either manufactured here or abroad, but of course we're talking about importation here, so mostly we're talking about things that are manufactured abroad. And it applies to imports that are being done by anybody. Everybody is subject to the requirements of the Clean Air Act. Next slide.
Okay, so how do we determine filing requirements for vehicles and engines? Essentially, the PGA message set, the ACE PGA message set, is a replication of the data that you find on the EPA forms, the 3520-1, which is the import passenger vehicles, highway motorcycles, and whatnot, and then the EPA form 3520-21, which is the heavy-duty and non-road engines, etc. One of the questions that filers, brokers have is, how does the importer have to present the documentation to me? What's the data that I need to file to meet these requirements? So Mario, can you expand a little on what the importer can provide? Does it have to be the form?
Well, it doesn't have to be the form. The form is actually a fantastic resource so that people can see what what is covered by the regulations and what the exemptions and exclusions are, and these forms are readily available on the internet. So if you click on the web links that are shown here, you would actually get these forms, and you could look at them, and you can actually, it's a PDF, you can print it out. And if you look at the form, it talks about the various kinds of vehicles and engines and the regulations that actually apply to them if you want to actually go to look at that. And I think even the forms themselves have hot links to the regulations. So they're very, very user-friendly. And the forms are what we used to use when people were declaring importations. Now, of course, we have ACE. And what's happened with ACE is, even though it doesn't look the same, the information that's requested in these forms is what is incorporated into an ACE filing for either a highway vehicle or engine or for a non-road. Here, the slide says small equipment and tools, but it also means large equipment. The 21 is for the only highway stuff that could be covered by a 21 is heavy duty, like real big highway going trucks, but everything else that's on the highway would use the 3520-1. Okay, next slide.
And Mario, and so if people have questions on what do they file or need help walking through the forms, they can contact the Vehicle and Engine Hotline, and that information's right here on this slide.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed that bullet. That's a very important one. The EPA has this hotline, and the purpose of the hotline is to help importers and filers know what they need to do to import a vehicle or engine. Ideally, this would happen before an importation takes place. Once the thing is here at the port, it makes it a little more difficult to deal with it if it's not a legal importation. But the V&E hotline folks can help folks, and you can contact them through a phone or that email address. And just so you know, EPA has very thorough pages that talk about importing vehicles and engines. If you just Google something, importing a vehicle into the U.S., you're going to get an excellent website that has everything you need to know about importing a vehicle for EPA purposes, and it even refers you to other regulatory agencies that you might want to look at, like, for example, the Department of Transportation. They also have rules for importing a vehicle. So make your clients aware that all these resources are out there. Next slide.
And just on a caveat, imports at EPA.gov is not for any other type of EPA filing but vehicles and engines. Don't email imports at EPA.gov on a pesticide question, because they'll just be having to forward it to the appropriate party. Also, your client can, give you EDI data. They can give you the data on their commercial documents. Once again, they don't have to fill out the 3520-1. Brokers have questionnaires, but as Mario mentioned, the form itself is a great resource, and it has a lot of the information of the nuances of what's required to file. All right, so if you have goods that are not regulated by EPA V&E, you use disclaim code A, product is not regulated by the agency. Make sure your commercial description is sufficient to substantiate to EPA why you're disclaiming this particular item. In the ACS days, the disclaimer flag to FDA, for example, was just that, the disclaimer flag. Now the commercial description goes with that disclaimer. So if you're too generic, EPA is going to maybe have to take a look a little closer, and you do audit these disclaimers, right, Mario?
Yes, that's right, and they are a bit of a concern for us. People that are importing a lot of goods and are disclaiming a lot, where the harmonized tariff schedule suggests that they should be filing, are something that we are probably going to start looking at, and be aware that EPA jurisdiction does not end once the merchandise clears the border. We have jurisdiction throughout the lifetime of the equipment. So just because it clears the port doesn't mean it's scot-free. But I think Sandy wanted me to mention a couple of examples of what could be disclaimed. And I mentioned that most engines that burn some fossil fuel are regulated by EPA. But that doesn't include everything. Like, for example, EPA does not regulate aircraft engines, because aircraft engines are actually regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration. And so if you're importing an aircraft engine, you would not declare it for EPA. You would just disclaim it under Code A. It's not covered by an EPA regulation. Similarly, if you're importing an off-road piece of equipment like some kind of electric scooter that's not for use on the road, that one is also not covered by an EPA regulation, and you would also disclaim that under A.
What about electric vehicles?
Okay, I don't know if we were going to talk about this later, but electric vehicles are an important exception to the disclaim under Code A rule, and that is because under the Clean Air Act, EPA is required to regulate all motor vehicles. It doesn't say all motor vehicles that burn fossil fuel. It says all motor vehicles, and so we do regulate electric cars like Teslas. In fact, we also have to regulate them for another reason, is because we also have to calculate their equivalent fuel economy. If you're importing a vehicle that can be used on the highway, and that includes any automobile or truck that can be used on the highway, or any motorcycle that can be used on the highway, and basically, a highway motorcycle has a headlight, a tail light, a stoplight, license plate brackets, that kind of thing. If it can be used on the highway, if it can be licensed for highway use, then it needs to be declared as a vehicle for EPA, and I think that pretty much covers it.
Great. All right, so the next disclaimer that we come across is if it's an original equipment manufacturer. If they're the actual original equipment manufacturer is the importer of record, and it has a certificate of conformity, they are not required to transmit the PGA message set, and it's disclaimed with B, data not required per agency guidance. And Mario, maybe you can clarify for us, who qualifies as an OEM?
Okay, I'll talk about OEMs. The term refers to what are called original equipment manufacturers, and pretty much if your client is an original equipment manufacturer, they will know it. For EPA purposes, an original equipment manufacturer is the entity that actually worked with EPA to get a certificate of conformity for their vehicle or engine. They did all the testing for it, and they are the ones that paid the money to get the certificate and obtained it from EPA. And so basically, we know who these people are, and we trust them to import legitimate things. And so if you're importing something that is, if you're an OEM and you're importing something that is covered by a certificate that you obtained, then you're not required to declare that. So, for example, if you are Toyota and you're importing a ship is coming in with 300 Camrys in it from Japan, you don't need to file for that. You just do a disclaim under Code B because EPA doesn't require information for that. However, if you're a Toyota and you're importing BMW or a dozen BMWs, then you would need to file because you are not the holder of the certificate for that vehicle. So the companies that qualify or the entities that qualify as OEM are the ones that actually get the certificates from EPA. And if that's confusing, there is a link there where you can actually look to see what is the actual definition of what an OEM is for EPA purposes. Data not required by agency guidance. There are other possible reasons why you wouldn't need to file, because EPA has given other guidance that says whatever this is, you're not required to declare it. But all of that would be expressly highlighted in the declaration information. I'm sorry, in the importation information that EPA has in its websites that I mentioned earlier. That if you don't need to declare something, it would be listed in there. Next slide. Or any Roy or Sandy, you want to add to that?
No, that's good. That's good.
Okay, so what are the other two types of disclaimers? There's actual goods that are subject to V&E filing requirements, but as a filer, you can't file the message set for whatever reason, or you choose not to file the message set. You have two options: disclaim code C. This means that the data is filed through other agency means, and that means that you're uploading the completed form, the actual EPA form 3520-1 or the -21, the completed form, and uploading it through DIS. There's also disclaim code D, which means that the data is filed through paper, which in essence means that the goods accompany the form and the form is tendered to CBP at the border. It is not something that's used a lot. I don't think, Mario, I think maybe less than 20%. The benefit to do the transmission through ACE is that ACE has edits to make sure you have the right engine family name, et cetera, that we're going to touch on. And you get, if all your data is correct, you get an automatic may proceed. If you choose option C, it's not going to be an automatic may proceed, and EPA has to review that filing. Anything else you gentlemen want to add to that?
I think that pretty much covers it. The disadvantage of the advantage of C and D is that you can do it on paper. And D, usually what the people that do D are the individuals that get to the border and say, oh, geez, I didn't know I needed to file this, and so they quickly fill out the form. The advantages of not disclaiming with C or D are that, as Sandy said, if the information you're filing is correct, it will all be cleared automatically by the system. And nobody has to look at it. It'll just be, you'll get an automatic may proceed. Also, the C and D don't allow you to really, well, C a little bit, but D does not allow you to do the clearance significantly ahead of the importation. Whereas if you file the full message set, then you could do that many days, 10 days, 15 days, 30 days even, ahead of the actual importation. So if there are any glitches, they can be resolved before the merchandise actually arrives, and there's no risk of it sitting at the port. Anything else, Roy?
So the lesson is try not to use C and file the full message set. All right.
Right.
Roy, do you want to touch a little bit on the actual?
Sure.
Messages?
So we went through all the tariff codes with customs, and we went and set these may be required flags, which for vehicles and engines would be an EP3, and the way the tariff codes are described, they don't really describe everything we regulate. So it's really not possible for us to ever really definitively flag all the tariff codes that need to be flagged. So the moral of the story is that your importer, that the importer of the vehicle or engine is responsible for knowing whether they need to file whether or not a tariff code has been flagged or not. So let me say that again. The importer is responsible for knowing if they need to file whether or not a tariff code has been flagged. So that's really important. I get that question every day. So what happens when you do file? What does ACE tell you when you file a PGA message set? Well, if you start to file and you leave out a bunch of information so that it can't even process, you're going to get a reject. And we call this a bucket one reject. And that means that nothing processes for EPA or customs. So you really need to get it right. Your CBP client rep for the brokers out there can help you see what the errors are for that reject message. And that's pretty important to help you understand what did you not do that you need to do. Then let's say that you do file and you file all the information you need to file, you'll actually get an accept message. And that's good, and that means you've passed the bucket one rejects, and now you have a bucket one accept. And then there's more data that we actually look at very carefully. Like really the most important piece of information is the test group name, engine family name, because it tells us what's been certified or not. And we provide a list of that every night to Customs and ACE to check against. And so if you have a typo or if you misinterpret a number or a letter, it's not going to pass that automatic check. And what happens is that will throw what's called an under review. And that means that some of the data that it should be there is not there, or it's just not done correctly. If you do receive an under review, you can make corrections prior to arrival and prior to 10 days after arrival to try and correct your mistake. And if you do file everything correctly, as we've stated earlier, you actually get a may proceed automatically. And we've noticed that people who've been doing recurring shipments have really gotten pretty good at this. And I think the overall rate of automatic may proceeds that people are getting is in the upper 80 to 90% of all filings, which is pretty good. So the moral of the story is, if you file early so that you can make any corrections if need be. And I think with this, CC, if you could kick off the next polling question, that would be great. So this is a hypothetical, but it's actually real. So for an ocean shipment, how early can you file the declaration? Okay. And oh, this is great. Well, so I think most everybody gets this, that really you can file the declaration information basically when it's loaded on the vessel, which can be as far as 60 days out. But however, most of you actually answered 5 days prior to arrival, because that's when customs actually clears it. But the beauty of being able to file the PGA message set earlier is you can still get that corrected even before that 5-day clearance by customs. So just wanted to point that out to everybody. All right, I think we can go back to the slide now. So I just want to stress that if you get it under review and you can't figure out why it's wrong, and time keeps ticking by, and Mario is only one of 2 people handling hundreds of these errors every day, and you get to a point where you're 10 days after arrival, ACE will not allow you to make a correction.
Yeah, Roy, if I may,
Yes.
that's a hugely important point. There is this impression that a lot of people have, and maybe it's a language here, where it says under review, that when you file something and it gets under review, that somebody's actually looking at it. That is not likely to be correct. It's more likely that it's just an indication that what you filed has some problem, and it'll just sit there. So immediately upon getting it under review, look at what you submitted and see if maybe you made some kind of error. Don't assume somebody's going to look at it and call you and say, hey, you guys, you did something wrong, try and fix it. Okay, under review doesn't mean a person looks at it. It means the system has found the problem and is alerting you that there is something that needs to be corrected.
Right, and I get many of these a day where people say, hey, my this entry number is under review, and they don't even tell me what commodity it is. And I have to say, oh, well, is it a vehicle or engine? And if so, did you do the following things? And I point them to a tip sheet that you can see later. So let's say that Mario wasn't able to get to your filing to see what was wrong, and 10 days have elapsed since the goods have arrived at the port of entry. What can you do? On a one-time basis, Mario and the one other guy that works with Mario will allow you to actually get the 3520-1 or -21 or whatever document you're filing, and allow you to get a signed copy and upload an image to DIS. And you would have to contact Mario to let him know you're doing this. And that's really the only option after 10 days. And that takes time. And it is a one-time event, and it's something we really don't want to be doing at all. And I will say this, that there are certain ports in particular where brokers are used to filing the day of arrival, or maybe the day of before arrival. And these are big ocean ports. And that's just an old bad habit that now doesn't really apply and can actually work against you if you have errors that you don't get corrected after the 10-day window is gone. So it's really, really important you file early and get that correction made if you need to file a correction. And then what under review means also is that Customs is releasing it from the port, but it really shows that, as Mario had said, that you don't meet EPA's filing requirements. And at some point, it could be subject to potential enforcement. But at any rate, that's generally what it means. So I think that's all I wanted to cover on this slide. And Mario or Sandy, I don't know if you want to mention anything else.
Yeah, one last thing. Under review, almost always is some filing errors. Some numbers got transposed, or something was just missing. Very little of it has an issue where something is an actual illegal importation. But we need to look for that. So the ideal thing is to get the errors corrected before I have to look at them personally.
All right, next slide, please.
All right, so filing documentation in DIS for goods regulated by EPA. Two things you need to know is make sure you're always using the proper EPA agency document type. We have three: the EPA, the 3520-1, the 21, and any exemptions. So if you're filing disclaimer C, you have to ensure you're uploading in DIS the actual EPA completed form, applicable form with the right code. Don't put CBP as a document type because then EPA cannot see it. If your shipment is also subject to an exemption letter, you would have to upload that as well. Under the exemption type, EPA 05 code. Also, Mario's going to touch a little bit about if you have a shipment that's under review, sometimes it's helpful to also supply additional data through DIS, even though you've transmitted the full message set. If you want to expand on that, Mario.
Well, even if it's not under review, you're not going to know whether or not something's going to end up being under review But there is an opportunity to load all kinds of documents in the DIS and helpful documents that allow me to review stuff without having to contact you or or the importer. Are things like bills of lading or invoices for the goods that are being imported, and also photographs of the EPA label. And we're going to talk a little bit about the EPA label shortly, but often the label has issues. It may be broken or damaged in some way. And if I can look at the image and see that it is a legitimate label, even though it may not be possible to read it properly to get the full engine family name, for example, something we'll talk about in a moment, then I'll be able to clear that entry without having to contact anybody or with minimal contact through an email or whatever. So having used the possibility of uploading documents to DIS because they're helpful. Any kind of evidence that you have that supports the importation of vehicle or engine is useful. If, for example, you have U.S. goods returned, somebody took their car to Qatar or whatever for a year and they're bringing it back. They originally bought it in the U.S. and they're bringing it back. They forgot to look for the engine family name, but they have their registration from before they left. That could be useful, and it could enable me to say, okay, I buy that it's a U.S. vehicle, and I may let it go just from that. So it's useful to load documents in DIS. You never get penalized for loading excess documents in DIS, as far as I can tell.
So more for the unusual importations maybe than a standard certified import. But
right.
Also, there is no specific document type for other. So if it's pertaining to an on-road highway vehicle, you would just use the EPA 01, the actual form number to upload your documents. All right, so this is the actual V&E message set. It just goes through the PG records. It's not a lot of records, but it is complicated depending on the import and industry code. That's where we get kind of the complexity comes in. Unfortunately, EPA does not send back the error code that tells us which PG record is causing the under review. So it is a little, misleading for filers. They get confused about that. Not like FDA is pretty good to come back and say it's missing PG, whatever. So it's something I think NCBFAA is working with customs to see if we can enhance the messaging back to us. But nevertheless, this is the message set. Work with your importer to make sure you have all the required data elements for your particular importation. So tips for filing V&E, as it's been mentioned and will be mentioned often throughout, is that the #1 cause for under review is the test group name, engine family name, and the PG14. Recommendation that you take these steps before you transmit, ounce of prevention, is, as Mario mentioned, obtain a picture of the emission control information label. It contains the test group or engine family name, and this is the key information to show that a vehicle or engine has been certified and can be imported. There's a useful link here that EPA has provided that helps guide an importer where the label may be found. You can also Google your test group or engine family name prior to filing to ensure that the number is accurate. And we're going to touch a bit more on that in a moment. So you can actually Google, where is the John Deere engine label location? And it might come back with a picture to tell you where the importer can look for the label. And here's an example of an engine family name that came back with a Google search result that says it's actually that vehicle you're importing or that item you're importing. So additional tips for filing the accurate test group name, engine family name, is make sure it's properly formatted. It has to be 12 digits long. Make sure your software vendor has an edit in place to help you get this right if possible. If you're wondering if it's an O or a 0, or is it an 8 or a B, at least positions 6 through 9 is an engine family name displacement. And these are always either numbers or punctuations. What is a displacement, Mario? Can you emphasize what that's all about?
Okay, I'll go real quickly through each one of these. Model year, we're going to talk about in a minute. Manufacturer code, this is the code for whoever it was that obtained the certificate of conformity, and that can be letters or numbers. Usually it is letters. Industry code is the type of engine or equipment being imported. It is always a number. 6, 7, 8, and 9 are always numbers. Sometimes there is a period in there, and this is the engine displacement. Basically, how big is the engine? How many cubic inches is it, or how many cubic centimeters it is? So if you had a 5-liter engine, it would have like a 5.0 there, and then the last 3 digits, 10, 11, and 12, that can be any number or letter. So again, position 1 can be a number or a letter. It's always a model year code, and we'll show you what to pick for that. 2, 3, and 4 can be letters or numbers. 5, always a number. 6, 7, and 8, always numbers, often with a period in there. A period would take up a full position. And 10, 11, and 12 can be either letters or numbers.
Mario, is the number always 12?
I'm sorry?
Is the number going to always be 12, or is there exceptions?
Well, it almost always is 12. Certainly in anything that is new, currently built, it's going to be 12. Some of the older engine family names many years ago were less than 12 digits. Also, some manufacturers insist that their engines are covered even if they don't put the model year code in there. So sometimes you get 11 digits, but that is the exception rather than the rule. Almost all of them will have 12 digits. I'd say 99% or 98% of them should have the 12 digits. If you're not seeing 12 digits, there's something a little unusual there.
Okay. Thank you.
And I think, Sandy, I'm sorry, Sandy, we were talking about an example where you had sent me where you saw 10 digits.
Yeah.
And that was a label that actually was damaged, and the portion that had the engine family name was missing, and you could only see 10 digits. And that's an example of one of those that I said, if you sent me a photo of that label, either through an email or a DIS, if it was included in the DIS, I would say, oh yeah, that looks like a perfectly legitimate label. I recognize these are sometimes damaged, and I would let that thing go. So that's one of the examples of where DIS is useful.
Right. All right, and lastly, EPA has provided us a great link that has all of the engine family names by type. If you want to expand a little bit.
Yeah, this is a fantastic resource, but you have to know what you're looking for. The first thing on there is heavy-duty evaporative components. Don't pay attention to that. We are not looking for any evaporative information in the ACE filing. And then it talks about heavy-duty highway gasoline and diesel engines. These are the ones that were filing under the 3520-21, but are actually for highway use. So these will be your Caterpillars and your other big truck engines like that. Heavy-duty vehicles are also the same. Are probably another one that you would not be using a lot because for the big trucks, the heavy-duty trucks, it's the engine that we certify, not the vehicle, at least for the purposes of ACE entries. And then most of the other ones do have a role here. Non-road spark ignition is basically an engine that burns gasoline. So large non-road spark ignition, that's probably construction equipment. Light-duty vehicles and trucks, that's most of what you see on the highway. Cars, trucks, vans, stuff like that. Locomotive engines is self-explanatory. Marine compression ignition, that is a diesel marine engine. Marine spark ignition is gasoline marine engine, outboards and inboards. Motorcycles, all-terrain vehicles, and utility vehicles. That includes both on-road and off-road motorcycles, as well as UTVs and ATVs and other types of recreational vehicles. Non-road compression ignition, those are big diesel engines for off-highway use. Evaporative components, again, do not pay attention to evaporative components. We don't do anything with them in ACE. Or with portable fuel containers. Small non-road spark ignition, that's the small engines that burn gasoline, and then of course snowmobiles. So if you can't find engine family name, and you know you're importing snowmobiles, for example, click on that, and it'll have all the engine family names for the past 8 or 10 years, and it should be on there. So if yours is a little off compared to what is on the list, then that will tell you that maybe there's something wrong. Okay?
All right, I think we want the next and last polling question, Cece. All right.
This is an example of where all of the above is almost always the right answer, isn't it?
It is.
You didn't get too complicated with A and B only, etc. All right. Now we're just going to touch quickly on some specifics for the 3520-1. I just want to give you an example. The EPA supplemental guide has done a really nice job of tying the actual form to the data set. So, you know, if you're new to this, I highly recommend you're using this and an additional link we're going to show you later to help you navigate the data set. These are some examples of passenger vehicle data elements. The import code is the provision for import. And Amari, I don't know if you want to touch on a little of these nuances.
Okay, I'll touch real quick on this. The vehicle identification number, one useful thing to know is that all highway vehicles and many non-highway vehicles will have a 17-digit vehicle identification number that conforms to requirements that the Department of Transportation have. That provision or that requirement always says that the 10th digit is the model year. And Sandy very usefully put a table there that lists the actual number or letter that would be for a given model year. So for example, for 2007, it's a 7, but we also have to use letters. So for 2012, it'll be a C. One other useful thing to know is that that letter should correspond to the first letter of the engine family or test group name. Test group is what is used for highway vehicles and engines. Engine family is what's used for everything else, but the two are basically interchangeable. They're always 12 characters. The first character of the test group or engine family name is always the model year, and it should correspond to the model year in the VIN, the 10th digit. Okay?
All right, what I wanted to mention here is the manufacturer. You only have to have the name of the manufacturer, Toyota, Lamborghini, BMW. You don't have to go and find the address where they made the vehicle. Folks on my shop were doing that until we got the edits in place. So it's just the name of the manufacturer. like we mentioned before, that link as to where you can find the engine label that has the name. You wanted to talk a little bit about the letter of approval?
Yes, and a couple of things you reminded me. For almost all smaller highway vehicles, the ones that don't have the heavy-duty engines, the label will be under the hood. So if you go home and look at your personal vehicle, you lift the hood, there'll be a label that says important engine emission control information, and that label will have the test group name. For engines that are covered by the Form 21, it's almost always on the engine itself. The other thing that we needed to talk about is the exemption numbers. If you look at the form, the 3520-1, for example, it has several categories that are actually not covered by a certificate of conformity. They won't have an engine family or test group name, for example, a racing car. But EPA allows those to come in. But if you look at the form, the 3520-1, it says EPA letter of approval is required. So before you import your race car, you are supposed to contact the imports hotline and say, hey, I'm bringing in this race car. And then they'll send you a little questionnaire, and then you answer that. And then they'll send you a letter saying it is okay for you to import this race car. The letter at the very top will have a long number. That number goes in the PG-14, where the license permit certificate or other or LPCO would go. It's the same place where the test group or family name goes, but as I said, this type of thing, it's exempted, and so you wouldn't put the test group name, you would just put the letter number on there. And again, ACE will look at that, and normally it'll clear automatically. One last nuance here, there's a listing of a bond. This is a type of bond where certain types of equipment are imported temporarily. Vehicles or engines are imported temporarily. We want to make sure that they are exported again. So this is not a bond with EPA. This is a bond through normal customs procedures that just ensures that a vehicle that is only here temporarily is exported again after whatever it is that needs to happen happens. Say, for example, a vehicle that's being repaired or something like that. If there's a bond associated with that, that's just to make sure it gets exported again. Okay?
Okay, and then there's some nuances depending on the import code, and you'll see that when you look at your, when you may need a model year, or you may need the engine power rating. So here's, as Mario was mentioning, the actual, excerpt from the forms where you'll see exempted vehicles, excluded vehicles, temporary imports, and the certified. So the import codes will tell you what you're going to need to declare based on.
Sandy, let me just expand on that just a little bit. Exempted means it's a type of thing that is otherwise regulated by EPA, but for whatever reason, it has an exemption. Like, for example, if a vehicle is 21 years old, it's okay to import it, even if it doesn't actually have an engine family or test group name. It would be normally regulated, but we exempt things that are more than 21 years old. Excluded means they are not covered by the regulations at all. And temporary means it's okay to bring it in for a little time, but it has to go out again. That includes things like display for a museum, for an auto show, or testing. You're bringing it in for testing, or you're bringing it in to be fixed, or you're bringing it in to put armoring on it, for example, or something like that. Those are temporary imports. They are required to go back out, and they may be subject to a bond, the bond I talked about earlier.
But excluded doesn't mean you don't have to transmit the data set. You have to transmit the data set. It's just not regulated.
Right. You would just transmit the data set and check the appropriate box. For example, you're bringing in a racing car. You check in code L, and you make sure you include the information on the top of the letter that you got from EPA that said it was okay to bring it in the PG-14.
Great. And here, this is a little busy, but this is in essence from the supplemental guide. It'll help guide you if you have a B, which is a U.S. certified vehicle, that's when you need the test group name. If you have G, I, K, or J, you need the bond policy. If you have any of these codes, you need the exemption number that Mario was talking about. In addition, there's an Appendix A that tells you additionally what you may need. So it's very useful to have the form and to have the supplemental guide ready for you if you're doing something unusual other than a U.S. certified vehicle. Mario already talked about bonding requirements and exemptions a moment ago. Real quick about the used engines. Mario, you were going to talk a little bit?
This is a little bit confusing for many people. But basically, if you're importing new engines, you always have to file a declaration. But if you're importing used engines, meaning engines that have been used in a vehicle before and are being brought in as parts, EPA does not regulate those, and they can be disclaimed using Code A. Used engines are considered parts, and therefore they are not regulated.
But only for the light-duty motor vehicles, right?
Thank you, Sandy, for emphasizing that. This is only true for light-duty motor vehicles. If you're importing a truck engine or a diesel bulldozer engine, that does have to be declared, even if it's used.
And once again, we can't emphasize enough how helpful the EPA hotline and Mario's team is, having the form, looking at the supplemental guide with Appendix A. The last thing we wanted to touch on quickly was the entity roles for filing the EPA message set. There's really 4, the importer, owner, certifying individual, and manufacturer that are mandatory. Once again, manufacturer name only, importer, owner, and certifying individual name and address and point of contact. And the storage location, although not mandatory, it's helpful for you to provide just the point of contact only of where the goods will be located. Lastly, we have taken an excerpt of what this certifying individual is actually certifying. And Mario, you wanted to kind of emphasize a little bit about what this all means.
Yeah, so just be careful what you're signing and what you're doing. I know a lot of you, there's a strong incentive to help your importer get whatever they're wanting to import in, but you don't want to be a co-conspirator in case they're importing something illegal. So if you are not satisfied that there is a legitimate engine family name, do not just pick one from the table and put it in there. That puts you at risk, and I don't think you want that kind of risk. It's important to inform importers if they may be having something that's illegal. Let them know that they should not bring it in, or that there may be problems at the border.
Yeah, and as a broker, you probably don't want to name yourself as the certifying individual. All right, let's move on to quickly cover the nuances of the 3520-21, the heavy-duty non-road engines. A bit more complicated. Once again, here's just an excerpt of the supplemental guide and how it ties the form to the message set. One nuance with the heavy duty is you have an import code in addition to an industry code that has to be declared. The 12 characters, the same with the manufacturer name only, but there's an additional requirement for the location of the build date. Mario, do you want to talk about that a little?
Let me emphasize that this is important. Basically, we know when a year, what year an engine family is from, for example. So if an engine has an engine family name on it, if it has a A, we know that's 2010. But we also need to know what date the vehicle or machine was manufactured. So it is not okay to import a bulldozer built in 2018 with an engine that was built in 2010. There is a requirement that no more than 1 year can lapse between the building of the engine or the engine family name on the engine and the actual equipment that it is installed on. So that's why we ask for information on the build date of the equipment so that we know that it is okay. And that's why we need to know where the build date might be. Okay.
Good to know. That's very confusing to me. All right. Secondly, for this portion, for the on-road, it's always the vehicle identification number, the VIN number that's used. But for the heavy duty and non-road, your message set has 3 different types: the engine serial number, the vehicle serial number, in addition to the vehicle identification number. What's the difference?
Okay, there's not always a difference, but we do need 2 of those. Engine serial number is always, well, any quality engine will have a serial number on it, and it's at the number on the actual engine. The vehicle or equipment serial number is a different one, so that we can, if you have a bulldozer, the bulldozer will have an engine, which is what EPA regulates, and it'll also have the rest of the bulldozer body, which EPA does not regulate, but we want to make sure that there's a correspondence, and that that type of engine is appropriate for that vehicle. So we need the serial number of the machine itself. Sometimes vehicle identification number is used for non-road. Very often, non-highway ATVs, UTVs, and motorcycles will have a VIN instead of a serial number, and that is fine. But we need the engine serial number and either the vehicle serial number or the vehicle identification number. Power rating is also another requirement that we'd like to see. Always there's an opportunity to put it in kilowatts or horsepower. And the model year of the vehicle or engine, that is actually that's not essential that you report that, but it is usually reflected in the engine family name. And last but not least, we have bonds, again, listed. Certain manufacturers in the United States have very little presence, and so if there is a problem with an engine or a vehicle manufactured by that company, we have difficulty going after them. So they're required to post bonds. So if you're importing an engine or a vehicle from one of these manufacturers that's subject to a bond, and here we're talking about things with small engines, basically, small spark ignition engines, they would have to have a bond. And most of the time, you're not subject to this. So all you have to say is exempt from bond. And there's a code for exempt from bond. You just have to put that code in there, and then you're free to go. If you're importing something that's made by a manufacturer that does require a bond, then we need the bond information here.
Okay. All right, so here's once again just a snapshot of the actual form, and as mentioned, we have the import code and the industry codes. The certified engine is the import code, and whether it's a heavy duty, etc., is the industry code. It gives you reference to the citations. It tells you whether you need additional information. Very useful to have the form handy.
And you would always fill out 2 things. You have to fill out the top A through J, which is what is it, and then the numbers are why is this thing legal to import? Is it certified or is it one of the other codes? So you need to check both what is it and why is it legal to import.
And the imports hotline can help walk you through this if you need it.
Yeah, very good resource. All right, so just another quick snapshot of the implementation guide. We'll tell you the code and when you need policy numbers or exemptions. So it's something good to walk through, call the hotline. And then again, the Appendix A for the 3520-21 will also help you correlate when you need additional data. So if you're new to this, I can't emphasize enough to have all of this handy. Once again, the import hotline reference, imports@epa.gov just for V&Es, and refer to the data we've given you. Once again, the mandatory entity role codes and the storage location, not mandatory but useful point of contact. And once again, what it is that the certifying individual is actually certifying. So make sure that you understand who you're putting on the hook for that certification. Additional resources, there's a link to the supplemental guide, and then Mario provided these two additional links that it's a tie-in, right, between the form and the PGA message set that apparently Mario says it's very, very useful to have handy as well.
Yeah, it's actually, this was actually put in there by Customs, but they're tremendously useful. It is exactly what it says, a crosswalk. If you have a portion of the form that you have, where does that appear in the message set? And I highly recommend that you look at these two crosswalks if you're doing any filings for vehicles or engines.
All right, EPA has been wonderful in providing us with filing tips for all of their what they cover, what they regulate. There's the V&E Vehicle and Engine tip sheet along with the others. Very useful. I think, Roy, if they come to you with questions about why something is under review, you usually send them to look at the V&E tip sheet first. Make sure you understand.
And what, that's right. And what those tip sheets are the most common mistakes that people make in their filings. So if we start seeing a lot of the same errors over and over again, we put information on how to avoid doing that and getting those errors in the tip sheets. And typically I'll have people contact me and say, you know, hey, I'm under review. And then again, I ask what commodity, and then if it's a vehicle or engine, I send them the tip sheet and say, please check yourself first to make sure that you didn't make any errors.
You'll also be sending them this webinar, right? Because we're recording it, and you can say, watch the webinar.
That's right. Well, we're going to put this webinar link at the bottom of the tip sheet.
Thank you so much, Roy, for your efforts with this. It's really helpful to the trade.
Good.
All right, and our last slide before we go to questions is just some additional links, the PGA forms list, the points of contact for agencies, the DIS implementation guide that has all the EPA or all the PGA specific document type codes, and then a quick agency tariff code cross-reference link that you may find useful. So with that, here's our contact information, and we have probably about 10 minutes maybe to go over some of your questions. And Roy, do you want to speak?
Yeah. So we've got some really good questions from folks. We may not be able to get through all of them, but I did want to jump ahead to a few that talk about the timing of the questions. So let me just see here. I have to scroll back up here. Yeah, Mario, most of these are going to be for you, but before we get into those.
Well, from looking at them, there are some of these questions that were asked very early that I hope we answered. So I'm going to actually work backwards from the more current questions.
Okay.
And let's see. Used engines can be disclaimed. Yes, used light-duty car engines can be disclaimed. Correct. Which form filed for a on-road? There is no such thing as an on-road non-highway vehicle. A 49cc motorcycle is a highway vehicle. An electric golf cart cannot be used on the highway. So electric golf carts wouldn't need to have any form filed. A 49cc motorcycle would need to have the regular 3520-1 form.
Right. Let me jump. Go ahead.
About disclaiming the wrong code. If the 10 days go by, what can you do? Well, that's probably by then you need to call somebody, call me, or call somebody else to try and fix it.
Well, that's why I talked about filling out a form or taking the image of the label and uploading it to DIS or emailing Mario. And it's a one-time event in order to handle that correction after that 10 days after arrival's already occurred.
3520-1 for remanufactured or used engines. Used engines, no. Remanufactured. Used engines, no. But if they're not for light-duty vehicles, they do have to have a form filed.
And that's if the engine is coming in on its own, right? Not a used car. If it's just a used engine coming in on its own and it's a on-road car, then you don't have to declare. But if you have to declare a used vehicle. I guess I'm just trying to make sure they understand.
That is correct. Used vehicles have to be declared, but the engines taken from used vehicles, used engines taken from used vehicles, don't have to be declared.
Okay, you want to keep working back, Mario?
Yeah, let's see.
I'll take the one at 152 if you want to take.
Okay, I'll take there's a motor or engine asking here.
Yeah.
You do need to ask if it's gas powered. It makes a big difference. A lot of things are powered with electric motors, and again, the only electric things that we regulate are highway motorcycles and highway cars or trucks. If they're not going to be used on the highway, we don't regulate them, even if they do have a motor, an electric motor. If you are an OEM, you don't need to have, if you are an OEM holder of a certificate, you do not need to file
There's three data elements you need to file. Only three: the agency EPA, the program V&E, and the disclaim code B as in boy.
And the commercial description, I think, right?
And the commercial description, yes.
All right, let's see what else we have here.
Well, let me jump in here. There's someone had asked about how does EPA then audit or verify the information filed as correct? Well, Customs or EPA then require DIS for the certificate of conformity. The answer to that second question is no, unless you didn't file correctly. So I mentioned earlier that we send over a list of valid test group name, engine family names, and that test group name, engine family name is actually a subset of the certificate number. So if you file that correctly and the computers do an automatic lookup and check, you should get that automatic may proceed if you filed everything else correctly as well. All right, that's that one, Mario.
Okay, a couple of quick ones. Are e-bikes under EPA? If the e-bike looks and feels like a motorcycle, yes. If it's just a bicycle, no. If you're in doubt, the EPA rules define a motorcycle. If it has a headlight, taillight, and stoplight, it is a motorcycle. That's all you need to look at. And if it does, then you need to file. There's some confusion about the bonding requirements. Real quick, if it's something that is imported temporarily and needs to go out of the country again, EPA requires what's a customs bond. It's no different than any other bond that you would get for another type of merchandise where customs requires a bond. So I don't really know what they look like because customs takes care of that. Or actually, you get it through a third party, a bond provider. The other types of bonds are where you are a manufacturer and you don't really have a presence in the U.S. You don't have an office. You don't have anything significant. So that company has to have a bond, an EPA bond. And if you're importing goods from that manufacturer, you need to just know what the number is of that bond so that you can put it on the form. So if you're not importing from one of those manufacturers, then you're exempt, and you just need to click on the message set where it says exempt from bond. All right, let's see.
And Mario, that's typically the smaller type.
Oh yes, this is only for small spark ignition engine equipment, so lawnmowers and things that have small engines in them. Quick question, bulldozers 2010, the engine is 2018, that is allowed. You're allowed to have a new engine on an old piece of equipment, but not the other way around. All right, let's see what else we got here.
Well, I think one more question, Mario, and then I think we're already over, and then we will come back with and answer any of the additional questions. Roy, Mario, if you guys are okay with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll take one more.
Why don't you pick one, Mario?
If you have one.
Okay, let's see. Oh, yeah, here's a good one. Are you required to report all serial numbers in your electronic filing? And yes, that is a common question, and the answer is no. If you have 500 things, you do not need to report all the serial numbers. Hopefully, they will be consecutive, so you can say, you can give us the first serial number in a set and the last serial number. But they're not always consecutive. For example, vehicle identification numbers always have a check digit in there that varies. So we could use, just like the last 5 digits of a serial number, just send a spreadsheet that has all the serial numbers, or at least a representative identifiable part of the serial number. You do not need to file a separate line with a separate serial number for each one.
So keep in mind, keep in mind that I'm going to use this example. Let's say you're bringing in 50 vehicles. The PG07 record has to have that first VIN number, or if it's an engine, a serial number. That is a mandatory data element for that very first one. The PG08 record are all the other ones that then follow. And you can either put sort of the beginning and end of the series if it's continuous, or that's where you would attach a spreadsheet to DIS, so that then Mario, if he needs to, can look at all the serial and or VIN numbers. But that PG07 record, and your software provider should be able to tell you that PG07 record is required for that first number.
And that's as long as everything else is the same, right? Year, make, model,
yes.
Everything else is the same. And then you can provide the actual VIN. Does that apply to VIN numbers too?
Yes.
Yeah. A couple of people asked if you're going to email this presentation. It's going to be on your website, is it not?
Yeah, we're going to do the printed presentation and the recorded presentation. And EPA will be so kind to answer the questions that we didn't get to, and maybe any of the questions, period, and come back with the answers once they vet their own, the questions and answers. So I guess, CC?
Yeah, with that concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for joining, and thank you again to Sandy, Mario, and Ray for putting together today's webinar and taking the time to present on this topic today. It will take a couple days to get the presentation up on the website, so I will be emailing out a PDF copy of the presentation to everyone who joined today for those that were asking. So thank you again for your participation, and enjoy the rest of your day.